the last topic that we talked about was the power of ideas, and that's important because in the work of faith-based diplomacy and reconciliation, whether you realize it or not, you're engaging ideas, and where faith-based reconciliation is different than, say, interfaith dialogue, is that in interfaith dialogue, basically people are sharing about their own religious tradition, they might talk about, say, the Quran or the Bible or, the Torah, but that's not what faith-based reconciliation seeks to do. It itself is presenting an alternative idea or vision, but it's one that's consistent with the various religious traditions. So that's an important thing to bear in mind, that you are engaging powerful ideas that motivate people to do what they do. So any questions or thoughts that may have come up since that time about ideas and ideology and what have you?
Not from my end, Father.
Okay, well, if nobody has any questions, we can move ahead with today's topic, which is the topic of social justice, seeking the common good. And you remember the first core value of faith-based reconciliation is pluralism. The second is compassion, inclusion. The third is peacemaking, and we spent a lot of time on peacemaking. So now we're going to talk about the fourth core value, which is social justice. And social justice involves seeking the common good of a community by transforming the soul of a community. Now, many people, are motivated and are passionate about what they call transformational work, but sometimes don't always understand what is it that brings about transformation. And secondly, have not really stopped to think about whether the transformation that they're anticipate is actually good for the nation. For example, we have a movement in America right now called Black Lives Matter, whose goal is to transform the culture. Only when you begin to look at the ideas that come out of Marxism, it's not really transforming the nation for the better, because rather than bringing about racial healing and justice, it's actually creating greater racial hostility and hatred. And so it is a transformative movement, but from where I sit, it's not transforming things for the better. So these are questions that I think anybody that seeks to be involved in transformational type of work in society needs to ask themselves. One, is what I'm doing, will it really bring about transformation and social change? And secondly, is it for the better or is it for the worst? You could say that the Nazis transformed Germany, but not for the better. And so this is something that we have to look at. When we think about better, we have to think about the whole thing of sometimes what we seek to do brings about unintended consequences that we didn't anticipate or we didn't think through. And sometimes we can actually cause damage by bringing about unintended consequences. Maybe we intended to bring about reconciliation, but in reality brought about greater division as a result. So these are things we have to be thoughtful about in the work of social justice. Now, I think it's important to actually define what we mean by faith-based social justice. I would have to say that social justice is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts on the globe. Everybody likes to use the term justice, and our movement is about justice, when in fact often it's simply about power or revenge, and it really bears little resemblance to justice. So I think it's important for us involved in the work of faith-based diplomacy and reconciliation to understand the true nature of justice that flows from the sacred scriptures. The first thing to understand about justice is that it assumes that there's a moral dimension to the universe which governs human relationships and structures. And this is really important. There's a moral basis to social justice. So secular forms of social justice often lack this because they're not rooted in a morality that comes out of the sacred scriptures. It may be a morality that is generated by human beings who decide at a certain point what is right and what isn't. Whereas in terms of the sacred scriptures, whether we're talking about like the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, and others, we're assuming that these are timeless qualities that define social justice. The reason this is important is that one of the big problems in the West today is certainly moral relativism. And I don't know if that's particularly a problem in India. You would know better than me. But many young people, particularly of the millennial generation, tend to be moral relativists. So they would typically say, well, this is right for you, but don't impose your values on me. This is, what I believe is right for me, what you believe is right for you. And so it assumes that all morals are relative and that there are no absolute morals. And that's an important distinction. Social justice has no basis at all if there are not moral absolutes. If everything is relative, there's no such thing as social justice. Let me give you an example. One time in one of my classes at the law school, somebody was going on quite at length at the concept of moral relativism and how, well, this is right for you, but it's not right for me. So I said, well, let me test that out. I said, I think torture is a very good thing. I think we should practice torture more and more. It gets people to do things that we want them to do. And they said, how can you say that? Torture is wrong. And I said, well, how can you say torture is wrong? Maybe it's wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me. So who are you to judge if everything is relative? You see, what people don't understand is that when you subscribe to moral relativity, you have no basis for saying whether something is right or wrong. And so people can commit genocide, they can commit human rights violations. And what basis do you have for saying that this is wrong if there are not moral absolutes? So judging whether something is right or wrong and establishing standards of human rights or what have you assumes that there are moral absolutes. And this is an important thing to grasp. And I have no problem making the case for moral absolutes, because you cannot have a functioning society apart from moral absolutes. The US could not function if we had half the people thinking that murder was a good idea and the other half thinking it was not a good idea. How can you live together in a society where there are no moral absolutes? So this is the first thing that to realize about faith-based social justice. It assumes that there are moral absolutes. Now, another thing too is to realize that social justice is about changing the minds and hearts of individuals to cultivate personal virtue rather than using political muscle simply to change the law and coerce mass compliance. One of the things I remember having a conversation one time with an attorney who was one of the leaders of the original American Civil Rights Movement. And I asked him, what would racial reconciliation actually look like? And he said, that's actually a great question. He said, I used to think that the path was to change laws. But what I discovered is that when you simply change the law, people will do what the law requires of them, but no more. And when you change people's hearts, then they will go the extra mile, as Jesus talked about, and doing something out of love rather than just because the law requires it. And that's an important thing, that when you use political muscle to force a certain change in a society, in the end, what it often does is it creates a sense of resentment and rage. And when the other group has its first opportunity, when it comes into power, it will undo everything that you've done. This is what we're seeing now, for example, in the US. So when President Trump was first elected, he undid a lot of what President Obama did. And now with President Biden, he's undoing a lot of what President Trump did. And so we may think that we're bringing about permanent change when in fact you haven't, because using political muscle rarely ever leads to permanent social change. It leads to anger and to resentment. Whereas changing people's hearts and building consensus is what brings about change. I think that the leaders of the first American civil rights movement were smart this way in recognizing that for whites and blacks to live together, that hearts had to be changed. And I think they came a long way in bringing that about. I think too, if you look at the work of Gandhi in India, I think he realized that political muscle was not the way forward in terms of the dealings with the British, that in the end, their hearts had to be changed to do the right thing, as he said. And that was why he adopted the whole approach of nonviolence, that in a sense, nonviolence was not an end in and of itself, it was a means to an end. Again, it, I think, reflected the fact that Gandhi's goal was to change minds and hearts. He even said that the minds of Indians and their hearts had to be changed because they could kick out the British, and then a group of wealthy and powerful Indians would take over, and nothing would change. And so I think one of the key goals of social justice is changing hearts and building consensus for change. Without that, you really, you may think you're bringing systemic change when in fact you're not. So this is an important thing to understand. So let me move on, and I've talked already about the moral basis. One of the interesting things is that the core or foundation of understanding social justice does not come from the documents of the United Nations. In fact, they come from the sacred scriptures. One of the things it reveals is God's heart for social justice. And this is there in the sacred scriptures in terms of how we treat one another. And so social justice has a religious basis. I remember when we were doing a faith-based reconciliation workshop with Kurds and Syriac Christians. The Kurds were notoriously secular not in the Indian sense, but in the Western sense, that they tended to not be very religious people. And I said that you're going to hear some religious ideas, but don't get up and walk out, because religious ideas are in fact the basis of political community. Where do you think that the ideas for building political community came from? Didn't come from the United Nations. It comes from sacred texts. And so, you know, we don't need to be the least bit apologetic that we're bringing religious ideas into this, because they form the basis for political community. And that's really important. Now, what do we mean when we talk about the common good? And I think in the Islamic world, they refer to the common and supreme good. And there are 5 basic elements that make up the common good. And I'm going to look at each one of those. The first is the respect for the dignity of every human being. This is one element of the common good. Second is the economics of compassion. Third is the politics of love. Fourth is the power of truth. And fifth is the sharing of privilege. So this means that every social group has to take into account the needs and legitimate aspirations of other groups. And this is part of defining the common good, as opposed to just seeking favoritism or power for our own group. The common good also involves a balance between my rights and my responsibilities. And often groups focus a lot on their rights, but they don't tend to talk much about their responsibility toward their neighbor. And our greatest responsibility, as is taught in the sacred scriptures, is to love our neighbor. So, for example, when I was working in the situation in Kashmir, I would be sitting with Kashmiri Muslims, and they would talk about the rights of Kashmiri Muslims, but I never heard them thinking about, well, what is their responsibility to the Pandits? What is their responsibility to the Ladakhis? So there was no sense of concern about about other groups. I found too that this ended up being reflected in their vision for the future. That, for example, amongst Kashmiris in the valley, they saw the Kashmir Valley as a place for Muslims, and they didn't see Pandits or other groups being part of the future of the valley. And so They weren't thinking of the common good. They were thinking of what benefited Kashmiri Muslims. And I'm not meaning to pick on just them. I mean, when I met with Panum Kashmir, they were not thinking of the good of Kashmiri Muslims. They were thinking what was best for Hindu Pandits. And I understand this is the nature of political advocacy groups. But at the same time, let's not kid ourselves in thinking that they're motivated by the common good, because that's simply not true. So let's look at these 5 elements of the common good, because they define what we're trying to achieve in social justice. Remember, social justice is a means to an end. Social justice is a means to achieving or realizing the common good for all concerned, for all groups in a society. And the very first element of the common good is what we call respect for the dignity of every human being. It begins with the understanding that all human beings are created in the image or the attributes of God. And that means that respect is part of what the philosopher Aristotle would define as our due. It's what human beings owe to each other. The Torah, the royal law of Jesus, the Sharia, they all affirm this, that at the deepest level, what we owe to one another is respect for each other. And why this is important is that I've encountered many so-called workers for social justice who are deeply disrespectful people. They show no respect for other groups, and yet they claim to be working for social justice. And if you don't have any respect for people from other groups, you're not really working for justice. You're working for power, or you're working for revenge. And that is not justice. One of the deepest roots of racism in America was the lack of respect that whites showed toward blacks. And that was the root. I mean, you could create laws that protected blacks in America, but what had to happen was there had to be a change in the hearts of whites that treated blacks with respect, because that's the minimum that we owe to one another. And there's a difference between what we're owed, which is our rights, and what we receive as a result of mercy or compassion. And I think sometimes people are confused between what is my right, what I deserve, and what I receive because of a compassionate, merciful society. For example, in the whole issue of dealing with immigrants that come to the US illegally, technically they have no rights. The only right they have is safe passage out of the country. But we've also said, because we want to be a compassionate society, we will provide health care if they become sick, things like that. But somebody can't come here and say, I have a right to free health care. And it's an important distinction between what is my right and what do I receive as a result of compassion and mercy. Two of the ways that respect is shown is in terms of human rights and religious freedom. These are two tangible aspects of showing respect. In terms of human rights, these are a complex set of freedoms that are given by God, not by the state. Our human rights do not come from the state. They come from God. That's what it means when we say that they're inalienable, because they come from God. And it's the state's duty to preserve those human rights. And in fact, I think the sacred texts teach us that God will judge the nations that do not respect the human rights of their people. And they have to be exercised in submission, meaning that in the exercise of my rights, I have to take into account the rights of others. I just don't have total, for example, the common illustration that people use here is I don't have a right to stand up in a crowded theater and yell fire. I might have the freedom to do that, but I have to take into account that it would cause danger to the other people in the theater because they would get up and run when maybe there's no fire and somebody might be hurt or even killed. And social justice is rooted in personal virtues. These are habits or skills that we develop which govern your passion or your emotions. Somebody may feel like they want to kill somebody, but they're restrained by their passions and emotions, and they make a choice not to do that. So in other words, social justice is involves a new set of habits to be learned. Let me illustrate what I'm talking about. My colleagues and I played a role in shaping the new social contract for the northeast of Syria. And they have some wonderful things in there like pluralism. The problem with that is growing up under the Assad regime is they didn't learn any of these behaviors. So you can put things down on paper, but they don't mean a single thing because that's not how people have behaved toward each other. And in fact, the Assad regime used pitting groups against each other as part of its strategy. So people didn't learn pluralism, they learned how to pit their group against another. And so how are people going to live in a pluralistic society when they've never behaved like that before? Just because people put something down on paper doesn't mean a thing. And they have to learn new habits, new behaviors. For example, personal virtue might include developing a pluralistic heart that seeks unity in the midst of diversity. It might involve developing a compassionate heart that seeks to be inclusive of others. It involves a peacemaking heart that seeks to solve problems rather than create more problems. It's a just heart that seeks the common good rather than just group power. It's a forgiving heart that seeks a future with others. It's a healed heart that seeks to be free of the wounds of the past. And it's a heart submitted to God's sovereignty that knows that they are accountable to God. So let me go on. The second aspect of the common good is what we call the economics of compassion. And justice always involves elements of economics, the sharing of wealth, and it involves concepts of fairness and sharing. This means equality of opportunity, but one of the things that we cannot guarantee is equality of outcome, because people may have equal opportunity, but they make certain choices about what they do with that opportunity, and some make good choices and some make bad choices. It's not unusual, for example, in America that people who are suffering, because they have squandered opportunity, they blame others for their situation, when in fact, they themselves have made bad decisions in their life, and they bear total responsibility for their situation. They can't blame an unfair society, for example, when they've made bad decisions. So, you know, that's an important thing to understand, is that a just society has to create equality of opportunity for people, but cannot guarantee equality of outcome. Another dimension of the economics of compassion is any society must have a compassion for the weak, the vulnerable, and the suffering. And this is a hallmark of a good and just society. It's an aspect of loving our neighbor that was built upon by Jesus. The third aspect of the common good is what we call the politics of love. Now, I started out in politics at the age of 12, so it was my first real passion in life. And I have to say that putting the words politics and love in the same sentence, I wouldn't even have considered. I would have just laughed. But in fact, that was certainly the model developed by Jesus, which desires a well-being for all groups in a society and impartiality in place of favoritism. So in India, Muslims in India have to be just as concerned about the Hindus or the Christians or other groups in India. And the Hindus there have to be just as concerned about the Muslims and the Jains and other groups in India. So, you know, it's normal to want to show favoritism toward your own group. And it's human nature to design systems that favor ourselves. For example, one common expression that you hear in America now is white privilege. Oddly enough, sometimes it comes from people of color who are live very privileged lives. But I can tell you, for example, when I've been in Africa, like in Kenya, I'll hear about Kikuyu privilege. In Sri Lanka, I'll hear about Buddhist privilege. So very often the dominant group in a society will tend to create the system to favor themselves. And I'll hear Christians complain about Muslim privilege in many countries. And so this is a human tendency, regardless of whatever religious tradition. Doesn't matter whether somebody is a Muslim, a Christian, a Buddhist, Hindu, that we tend to create systems that favor ourselves and our own group. And so the politics of love pursues social justice by building consensus towards sustainable social change. This is really important. It's not that difficult to get into power and then force our views on other groups. This happens all the time, particularly in authoritarian regimes. But in fact, the politics of love involves building consensus in society. So that means that the politics of love is a balance between the politics of advocacy, where you're standing for truth, and the politics of reconciliation, which is the pursuit of unity. Most of us, I would say, are probably somewhere in the middle, that we want something based on truth, but we also desire to see unity in our society. people who only pursue the truth are often very divisive people and tend to be what you would call your bridge burners. They're not interested in building bridges to other groups. They're going to proclaim the truth and as they understand it and just force it on other groups. On the other hand, those who are dedicated just to pursuing unity may do it at the cost that they don't actually believe anything deeply. They sacrifice truth in the cause of unity. So that's the politics of love. It's pursuing what is good for all groups rather than just simply privilege or favoritism for one's own group. The fourth element is the power of truth. And social justice always involves the element of seeking the truth. And might ask the question, what do we mean by truth? And truth can mean that it's in accord with the fact or reality. For example, you may have your opinion about something, but you can't, as they would say, make up your own facts. Facts are facts. For example, you may say that Modi is not the Prime Minister of India. Now, that might be your opinion, but you would be wrong because he is the Prime Minister of India. So there's a difference between opinion and facts. And the pursuit of truth is often based on fact, or it's based on faithfulness to an original standard. Or I think as people of faith would see it, that truth is based on divine revelation. And we see that God expresses what is true, and we align ourselves with God's understanding of truth. Also, we need to realize that our own perception of truth is often shaped by our own worldview, how we see reality. And that would include me and any of you, that we often don't realize how much our understanding of what is true is shaped by the world as we see it. So this is an important thing to be aware of as we become involved in situations of conflict, is that we bring our own worldview into the situation. Now, in pursuing justice, truth has to be tempered with love for our neighbor, or even love for our enemy, or it can simply become the pursuit of power, supremacy, or revenge. And so there's this element of balancing. Social justice involves balancing the pursuit of truth with forgiveness and love for our neighbor or our enemy. Without that, then what we may think we are pursuing in terms of social justice is really a pursuit for power or revenge or supremacy. I remember working with, when we did a workshop in Islamabad with Pakistani Kashmiris and from Azad Kashmir, and they define truth as basically winning out the cause for Muslims in the valley. So they were pursuing something based on what was good for their own group and not considering, for example, the plight of Pandits and other groups in the valley. I remember when I first raised the topic of the Hindu Pandits in Islamabad, I was told by my host to please don't talk about that topic. They said, we don't want to hear about it, you see. So I realized that if Kashmir was going to embrace a justice, that it had to, that they had to take into account the plight of the Kashmiri Hindu Pandits. And that took a while. Now, one of the concepts that is foreign in many places is the understanding of the faith community being a prophetic voice or a moral conscience in a nation. And in many ways, Gandhi was a prophetic voice and a moral conscience in India. The civil rights leaders in America were a prophetic voice and a moral conscience in the nation of prompting the nation to do what was morally right. I know, for example, when I lived in South Africa in 1984, the Anglican Church, which I was part of, served as a prophetic voice and a moral conscience in South Africa during the very dark years of apartheid. And this made it an enemy of the South African government because of that. The Anglican Church was seen as an enemy because why? They were speaking out against the evil of apartheid. The last element of the common good is what we call the sharing of privilege. And in the Enlightenment, which came to Europe, there was the concept that developed of what was called enlightened self-interest. What that means is that what I gather and earn in my life is for me, but if I have some extra, I will share it with others. In other words, it's based on a model of putting myself first, and if there's anything left over, then I will share it, say, as part of philanthropy with others. And I realized this was a strange idea, particularly when I talked to a group of Kashmiri businessmen and asked them to think about investing their financial resources in helping their fellow Kashmiris. And this was a strange idea to them. And none of them were willing to invest any of their financial resources in their fellow Kashmiris. So I thought, well, if you're not willing to invest in your fellow Kashmiris, why should I bother? You know, you're not even willing to invest in your own people. And so they didn't even have this idea of enlightened self-interest. But in fact, Jesus gave us a different model, which is that of dying to self. In other words, that my goal in life is not just to serve myself, but it's to serve others. It's a life of service, and it involves the sharing of privilege with others. Now, when we talk about privilege, we're talking about favor or opportunity that comes to us. Maybe it's earned, and maybe it's unearned. And privilege arises out of things like ancestry, family, social ties, education, political connections, or wealth. For example, one of the people I got to know during my time there was in India was Rajmohan Gandhi. And in many ways, he led a very privileged life based on his family background and the fame of his grandfather. And there's nothing wrong with that, but by any standard in India, he led a very privileged existence. Was it earned? Was it unearned? Well, I'm not in a place to judge that. In America, if you're born and your name is Kennedy or Clinton or Bush or Obama, you have privilege right away. And You may end up in one of the best academic institutions in America, not because you're the most qualified, but because you have a famous name. And so this is true in every society. There is privilege that comes from ancestry, family, social ties, education, political connections, or wealth. I remember when I was meeting with a group of Palestinians in Bethlehem, and they spent the whole time complaining about being victims to the Israeli occupation. Now, I noticed that the person who complained the loudest had arrived at the meeting in a BMW 7 Series car. He was wearing a Rolex watch. His family owned 4 businesses. He had gotten his university degree from Oxford, and on the speed dial on his mobile phone, he had the number of President Abu Mazen. Now, by every definition, he was a privileged person, but he saw himself as a victim. But his claims of being a victim rang hollow because by every measurement, this was a privileged person. There was an interview recently in America of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, and they live in my community, and they live in the very wealthy area of our community. I think they paid something like $14 million US for their home. And they were complaining about being victims, and nobody found that believable because by any definition, these are very privileged people. And so their claims about being victims, people just laughed at them because they didn't take them seriously. Now, in the work of social justice, reconciliation, our goal is to seek true social justice, and we have to be careful that we don't fall prey to the claims of privileged people who are crying out being victims. And I even met Kashmiris who made their living off of talking about the Kashmiri cause, and yet were very privileged people. They traveled in first class on the airplanes. They ate in expensive restaurants and everything, and yet they made their living off of, presenting the Kashmiri cause as victims. And so we can't be taken in by this. We have to pursue a genuine sense of what is just, what is true here, what is fair. How do we share privilege in a society? Privilege doesn't have to be a zero-sum game where if you gain privilege, I lose it. We can create privilege for people as well. So I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions about this.
Father Brian, there isn't a question, but I was feeling while going through it that we need to strongly work on the grassroots, because, changing the soul of the society, or, what was the other thing? That, reminding people what are the rights that God has given us human beings. This will take working a lot on the grassroots. This is what I felt.
Yes. Yes. I agree with you, Basit. Well, as I say, one of the challenges we face is that globally speaking, the concept of social justice has taken on a certain meaning to it which often bears little resemblance to a faith-based notion of social justice. And sometimes what you have are groups pursuing political power or revenge or supremacy and hiding it under the guise of pursuing social justice. I can tell you in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that it's rare to encounter a Palestinian who actually thinks in terms of what's good for Israelis as well as Palestinians. And there, in many cases with Israelis, you encounter people who are thinking what's good for Israel, but who don't care about what happens to the Palestinians. And so in the pursuit of social justice, there has to be a concern for the well-being of the other group as well. And I remember, for example, when I was meeting with the leader of the Islamic Front in Jordan, which was the political wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, and we were sitting in his office, and he just had one picture on his wall. It was a mural of Jerusalem. And I asked him, I said, I notice you have only one picture on your wall, a mural of Jerusalem. And he began to cry. And I said, what does that mean to you? And he said, oh, I dream of the day when Jerusalem will once again be an Islamic city and Palestine an Islamic state. And I said, well, what about the Jews? What about the Christians? And he said, let them go somewhere else. So you see, he wasn't thinking about the common good. He wasn't thinking about what's good for other groups of people. And this is particularly difficult for dominant groups in a society. And as a white in America, I can say that one of the challenges for whites is thinking in terms of what is good for Blacks and Hispanics and Asians and for all the different groups. What is the common good for everybody? So that's our goal. And more often, pious claims of social justice are really covering over pursuits of power, revenge, and supremacy. You know, when I was working with the opposition leaders in Syria, the more I listened to them, I realized that if they got rid of Bashar al-Assad and they got into power, that probably not much would change. It would just have new faces that would be controlling the security services and the secret police. Any other questions or comments at this point? We can pick it up the next time that we meet.
The politics of love at present era, if we see the era of Prophet Muhammad, this politics of love has played a very important role in making the people understand about the Islam, and this was the only technique and this was the only thing which Prophet Muhammad has opted during his lifetime, and that was a politics of love. And even another thing, that the expression of love, loving our neighbors. We believe that on the day of judgment and after that reincarnation, and we'll definitely be asked about our neighbors, that what were our behavior with our neighbors. That is in reference to the context of this politics of love. And one thing more than a Prophet Muhammad, when he was just coming every day from his house and he was going to the mosque for offering prayers and just for others, and when he was crossing from the street, and there was a one lady who was just putting trash on Prophet Muhammad, and every day she was repeating this. And one day when Prophet Muhammad just came across from that street, and the Prophet Muhammad, he did not just see that the lady has not put the trash on him. So then the Prophet Muhammad went inside her home, and then he inquired about her health and everything. That was a politics of love, not a politics of hatred. And so that was the act of Prophet Muhammad, that she embraced the Islam and she turned to the Islam. So at present, this is the only technique, this is the only thing which can opt. And sometimes, it is presumed that the Muslims, they are the jihadis, they are the terrorists. Why? That is the only thing, because we are not opting this thing. If we opt this love, and if we have a love for everyone, and we don't have a hatred for anyone, so I think that the actual meaning of the Islam, people can understand. And this stigma that we the Muslims have all over the world, I think that can be taken out from this.
Well, that's why I think that for Muslims involved in faith-based reconciliation, it's not a question of becoming more moderate. It's a question of becoming militants for reconciliation. And it's showing people the noble side of Islam. This is what I said, when I went right after the bombing in Paris with Charlie Hebdo, and I flew to Amman and met with all the top leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood there. And I told them, this is a very dangerous moment for you, because the public conversation in the West now is shifting from identifying the enemy as global terrorism to identifying the enemy as radical Islam. And I said, when the president of France uses the term radical Islam, you're in trouble. But I said, you have the power to make a difference. You have the power to show the other side, the noble side of Islam. And I said, I'm willing to work with you if you will give me access to your younger generation leaders. We will train them in faith-based diplomacy and reconciliation, and so that you can show the world the other side, the noble side of Islam. And I said, that's the opportunity I'm holding before you. So people already see you as part of the problem, but this is a way of saying you can be part of the solution. So that's, I think, in part our goal. I mean, there's no doubt that, the Islamists and jihadists have had a major influence in the world. So how do we raise up Muslims who are as militant about faith-based reconciliation, who show the noble side of their faith? And I think that's, if I can work with folks like Bazmi and Basit and Ramzan and Tahir and others, they will see Muslims who are working for reconciliation, and that's powerful. And that's being proactive in terms of loving your neighbor. At some level, when I think about who is my neighbor, I could say, well, why should I care about Kashmiris? They live on the other side of the world. If they want to blow themselves up, fine. It doesn't affect me. I can live in peace here in Santa Barbara, and they can blow each other up, and it doesn't affect me. But for some reason, God made it very clear to me that in my case, Kashmiris were my neighbors.
Yes.
And so I had to love them. And one of the things I learned when I became involved there was that for many Kashmiris, they saw me as their enemy because of the American involvement in the region, America playing a role in introducing the gun culture. And so for many Kashmiris, I was viewed as the enemy. So here was their enemy coming to talk about reconciliation. For some of them, that was very difficult.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But their hearts were changed.
Yes, we are the eyewitness.
So, you know, I have great faith in you guys that, you know, we can bring a different vision to the world. So, well, if nobody else has any other questions, our next meeting, I sent you an exercise called the privilege analysis exercise.
Yeah.
And so I want you to spend some time analyzing where you might enjoy privilege in your own life. And you may think you have no privilege, but you need to rethink that and think about where you might enjoy privilege in terms of your family, your education, your political connections, what have you. And it's an important thing to be aware of this yourself, because this is something that, as we talk to people about social justice, we have to get them to think through and understand better about where privilege plays a role in their own life. So I sent you a picture of the grid. So we'll do that exercise. I'll ask you each to share about where you enjoy privilege in your own life the next time we're together. Now, this coming Thursday, I'm going to be traveling. Yes. So if we could have our next meeting on Monday, is that possible?
Yeah.
So that gives you a week.
Yeah.
Okay. So next Monday, and let's make sure everybody knows that. Tamana's here, and Niraj, and Sahini, Basit, and Basmi. So the only one we're missing, I think, was Ramzan. And the only reason Ramzan would miss is if he had some real problems with his internet connection. So
I even called him, he did not reply. Maybe he's busy somewhere. Maybe he's having some important work.
We'll see. So anyway, so next Monday at this time, that would be 8:30 p.m. your time. And so we'll do the privilege analysis exercise. We'll see if there are any other questions about social justice. And then I'll be doing the next presentation, which is about being agents of social change. What does that mean? What does it look like? Okay, this is really important. So anyway, it was good to be with all of you today. And I will see you again next Monday. Remember, Thursday, we will not be meeting. Okay?
There's a message from Ramzan. So sorry for today. Was stuck in an emergency meeting. My apology to everyone.
So send it back. Watch the recording.
Yeah, sure.
All right, everybody. So Tom and I assume you're actually there.
Yes, I am, Brian.
Anybody switch on the video, please?
Just
Camera,
for
so that we should know that there is a real Sony, Neeraj, Tamanna, and Basit. Maybe there is some robot or anything else. No, it's
Oh
a real.
no, Vajni. Now the robot that I have planted will be exposed. Oh no.
No, there is a question. It comes on the internet. Is this you or some robot? So this is just to check whether this is a real human being or there is some robot.
I'm a humanoid.
Thank you, Tamanna. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Neeraj. Thank you, Basit. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
See you next week.
Soon. Take care.
Bye.